Welcome to In With the Old. We are a podcast focused on dispelling myths, building appreciation for God's Word, and helping you rediscover the Old Testament for the life of faith. I'm your host, Tim Howe, and I'm so grateful to be joined today by Dr. Dru Johnson to discuss his new book, Understanding Biblical Law, Skills for Thinking With and Through Torah. Dr. Johnson earned his PhD from the University of St. Andrews. He is a Templeton Senior Research Fellow and Director of the Abrahamic Theistic Origins Project at Wycliffe Hall, University of Oxford. He's also a visiting professor at Hope College, Director of the Center for Hebraic Thought, editor of the Rutledge Interdisciplinary Perspectives on Biblical Criticism series, and a host of other accolades that you can find for yourself online. And I'm so excited, Dr. Johnson, to have you here on In With the Old. I'm excited for this conversation. And what we like to do with all of our guests is ask them this question, just so we can get to know you and your background a little bit. What drew you to the study of the Old Testament?
I went to seminary as a fairly new believer. I'd only been a Christian for about 3 years, coming from a fairly non-believing background. And in seminary, I think it was just very natural to gravitate towards the New Testament. I don't know why, but maybe I was just fascinated with Jesus, so all the New Testament just made a lot more sense to me. And then when I graduated and started working as a pastor, I realized, I don't really know the Old Testament. And the more I read the New Testament, I realized they keep on referring to everything in the Old Testament. So I kind of made a vow to myself to only preach and teach from the Old Testament for the first couple of years as a pastor, just to force myself to stay in it. And then, of course, I fell in love with everything and realized it was a whole other world. And of course, the more I studied the Old Testament, the more the New Testament came alive to me, came up in 3 dimensions. So yeah, it's kind of where I always fell back to. And I also, probably like you, I just like seeing how you see the intellectual development of a concept in the Old Testament, and then how the New Testament authors pick that up and run with it.
Yeah, similar experience. Early in my own studies, I realized if I really want to understand the New Testament, I have to give more attention to the Old. And especially because the New Testament writers, they are picking up on things, they're picking up on traditions and then doing something with them. And if we miss that element, we miss so much of the meaning and significance of the New Testament. So, Dr. Johnson, I really am excited. I want to dive into this as listeners consider this book. A lot of books listeners on the Torah, they approach it from the standpoint of perhaps narrative, beginning in Genesis 1, Genesis 2, moving on to sin in Genesis 3, and then all the way to the end of Deuteronomy, getting us to nearly the promised land. And the narrative focus, the literary focus, those things are very helpful. And Dr. Johnson deals with that in his book, but he really approaches it from a different perspective that I so appreciate, and it's why I wanted to talk to him. He sees the Torah as formational instruction, something given to God's people in order to shape their imaginations. And so, Dr. Johnson, as we think about the Torah, one of the main contentions of your book is that for Western readers especially, as we look at the Torah, we tend to see it through the lens of modern law. And yet you argue that the Torah is really formational instruction as opposed to legislative prohibition, which is what we're usually used to. So how can you help us understand this distinction that is so important as we think about your work?
Yeah, that's a good way to frame it. I think the basic issue and it's not just Americans. I mean, you go anywhere where the Western legal tradition has had influence. So even when I'm in Kenya teaching, there's still a strong influence of British law. And of course, Americans are always very influential everywhere in the world. So you'll get it everywhere, just about everywhere. The problem is the framework of law that we bring to the biblical text typically is one that has developed basically since the Roman period, and then went through some transitions in the Enlightenment. And there were attempts to kind of bring biblical views of law into the American enterprise and even England as well. We can talk about maybe why those didn't work as well. But at the end of the day, we just have this very fused view of law that it is essentially rules that we either break or keep. In a liberal democracy like America, where liberal means that we're kind of free to do what we want, it means that unless there's a law that says I cannot do it, then I can do it, which every pastor hates this part of modern law, because you get people in your office going, well, where does it say in the Bible that I can't, do whatever.
Mm.
I can't go to the casino, or I can't have sex with my boyfriend, or whatever. And as soon as you're asking a question like that in scripture, you that should be your signal that, oh, I'm bringing the wrong view of law to the text. And it's nobody's fault. It's just what we're raised with. We just need to realize that they're dealing with an entirely different conception of law. And that would be true in Jesus's day. So when Paul is talking about the law has all of it, sometimes he talks about the law in a very negative way. I think most Pauline scholars would say he's actually talking about this Romanist legal view of the law that has crept into the
Mhm.
Jewish view of the law in many
Mhm.
cases. And now they are treating the Torah rather than God's guidance, right? So a great example of this is when Jesus gets confronted about the issue of divorce, and they say, well, Moses said to
Mhm.
us that a man can divorce his wife, right, under these conditions. Interestingly, Jesus does not enter the debate with Moses. He goes straight back to Genesis 1 and
Mhm.
2 and says, it was not so from the beginning, which means he sees there's a hierarchy, that you actually should have been able to see this thread developing from creation to what Moses says. You should actually be able to tie those two things together. And that's just very different than the way we think of law. Laws for us are punitive, or they have some kind of coercive or punitive force to them. You're going to get in trouble, or you're going to, get locked up or something, or you're going to have a fee or a fine. And that's
Mhm.
basically our own only mechanisms for enforcing law, right? And law has to be enforced. Not that this is entirely
Mhm.
absent from the Torah, right? You do have some rules that you do have to keep and that you can violate. So it's not like it's not entirely absent, but the thrust of what the law is doing is unique. I think the other big one that I would throw in here is we think of laws as completely independent of each other. Like the
Mhm.
law on murder has nothing to do with the law on manslaughter. I mean, legally, they have almost nothing to do with each other. And Jonathan Burnside made this point in his book on biblical law, is that there's no rhyme or reason to why modern statutes are in the order that they're in.
Mm.
You can put them in any order, right? But biblical law actually seems to have some collections within it and some reasoning going on as you work through it
Mm.
from creation into the giving of the law through Moses.
Yeah, such an important point. Dr. Johnson, I appreciated as you approach the legal texts within the Torah, you remind readers that the narrative text also helps shape and interpret the way we read those. And that was a thought I had with Genesis, especially. Sometimes we miss this basic thought that the foundation of the Torah, before you ever get to the laws, is narrative.
Right,
And I appreciate your introduction. You highlighted the freedom in the creation account, that there are relatively few laws. There's essentially a commandment, don't eat from this tree, but it really is, hey, here's the world that God has given you. Go and live as image bearers of God. But as you read the opening narrative, it's all about community. It's all about family, from Adam and Eve and their relationship as husband and wife, to Cain and Abel and whether or not I'm my brother's keeper.
right,
The word brothers mentioned 7 times in the Cain and Abel narrative.
right,
You see the family, the familial aspect grow, fall apart, and you see the need for a law. See the need for instruction, but
right.
it's all predicated upon a narrative. And so again, your approach helped to bring out the logic of the law, to bring out the community focus of the law. And one of the themes that you really hit on in your book so much is that the impulse, the aspiration of the law is protection of the vulnerable. As we read through the text itself over and over and over again, God's concern is to shape the imagination, to shape the mindset of his people to protect the vulnerable, consider the vulnerable. So maybe you could elaborate on that. You refer to it, I love this in your book, you refer to it as the North Star of Yahweh's aspirations for his people. So can you talk to us a little bit about the protection of the vulnerable in shaping our moral imagination through the law?
These protections that you're mentioning, when I teach Old Testament, year in and year out, in the church or in colleges, it's one of the things that I think is most shocking to students is
Mhm.
it's like they think you say biblical law, their first thought is like bring the hammer of judgment down hard on somebody for doing a very minor thing, right? That's essentially
Mhm.
their caricature of the law, which you can understand why if you read certain passages and certain parts of the history. You're like, why did God strike that person dead? But nobody is ever asking, like, what's the point of all of this, right? In what way is this a fulfillment of Abraham and his descendants being a blessing to all the families of the earth rather than a curse to all the families of the earth in some way? And so there's bits throughout, and I call it the North Star because they keep on coming back to this issue of people in their vulnerability need special protections. Now, I say that in an American context, it's probably hard for us to get our minds around what they actually mean by the vulnerable. Some of it would be familiar to us. So the vulnerable are not just the poor, the orphan, the widow, the foreigner. That's the typical, the typical four that are given for people who need protections. We go, of course, an orphan, a widow, the poor, or somebody experiencing poverty, I should say. Or the foreigner. Like, obviously, those people are in a sticky situation. They don't have full rights and protections that somebody in their natural family would have in their natural land with their own people. But it goes way further than that, right? So, in matters of justice, you get special protections for people who are wealthy, right? You get special protections for anybody who gets accused of a crime, and that can be anybody. Like, in fact, Naboth seems to be maybe possibly a victim that we can look at that exhibits this special protection for the poor. He is seemingly a well-to-do man who has a vineyard large enough that the king wants it, and two people conspire to kill him. So, like, he needed special protections in his vulnerability as well when two people conspired, well, three, I guess, conspired to kill him, including Jezebel. Drunk people, sleeping people, toddlers, people with dementia, there's all provisions within the law that says when people are in these vulnerable states, a strong man sleeps at night. A strong man might accidentally get drunk off of some strong wine and walk off or try to walk off the side of a roof, right? Like, everybody needs some protecting from themselves and for themselves at some point. And that keeps on coming up over and over again, and sometimes very explicit ways and sometimes some very subtle ways that you kind of have to think about. Why are they saying this particular law? And when you think it through, or as I like to say to my students, just game the whole thing out. What situation are they imagining here where somebody needs to be protected from themselves or from others?
Yeah. As we think about the narrative, I love how you stated in your book, everyone has the potential to be vulnerable. And especially in an agrarian context, we'll get to this later in the conversation, but you think about the vulnerability of food subsistence, you think about the vulnerability of war, you think about the vulnerability of famine, and we see this, right? And this is where I come back in my own heart and mind to Genesis. Man, you have Abraham, who's incredibly wealthy, you have Isaac, who inherits these blessings, you have Jacob. All three of those main characters, not to mention all the women who are mentioned as well, they are at one point blessed and protected, but all of them face incredible vulnerability within their stories. And so I appreciated you drawing that out, that the assumption of the law is that anyone can be vulnerable. And in one sense, it can happen almost instantly, at which point there's a vested communal interest in protecting the vulnerable because, hey, that could be you.
Right.
Maybe you could talk a little bit more about that.
Yeah, I think, well, that last sentence you said, I think captures it well. Protecting the vulnerable means protecting yourself, right? And so, this is like democratic republic ideals here, right? Is that you have laws that protect anybody in any possible situation. And by putting those in place and following them, we are protecting future us that might need those laws. I think this is the sentiment. The problem with biblical law, and it's the problem with Torah in general, you have to read across it quite a bit to pick up what's going on, right?
Yes.
And you may have seen some of my other writing and public discourse on daily devotional readings and how, everything I'm saying cannot be picked up in a daily devotional reading. Even if you read the Torah, 5 times in a row over the year or something like that, you really have to sit down and work through across these laws and through the stories and think. You have to think, and I don't mean by yourself, I should say y'all, in community, you have to think how these things are tied together. So I grant that it's not obvious at first to people who are coming from an entirely different legal mindset, who don't live in an agrarian subsistence world, where our problem is we have too many calories. We're in the exact opposite problem of every Israelite. We have too many calories. We have too much safety, too much security. And so now our problems are almost entirely revolving around our leisure and what we do with our leisure time and our leisure money, which turns out creates lots of problems as well. Like, apparently everybody being filthy rich in America doesn't solve all of our problems. So the opposite here is, I'm avoiding the word safety net because I don't think that's, I know there's some like political trigger words here, but I do think that there is this other person thinking that is in the Torah, ironically, it often gets attributed to Jesus, right? So love your neighbor as
Hmm.
yourself actually ends, a few inches down on the Leviticus scroll as love the foreigner as yourself, right? So it starts with
Hmm.
something a little bit easier and ends with something a little bit more difficult. You shall have the same laws for the foreigner and the native born. So it's a lot of this, like getting yourself outside of yourself, extending the natural boundaries of family and clan and protection and security in a fairly harsh world, extending
Hmm.
those the tent pegs out to include people that are not natural to include. The only reason you would include a foreigner is if you took them as a slave, right?
Hmm.
The only reason you'd include people who weren't in your family is if you were going to bring them in a lower position, basically.
Hmm.
So this is everywhere. So as soon as we're thinking in terms of love your neighbor as yourself, you're already in the realm of this. What would it be like if I were to if my crops were to fail and I were to slip into poverty?
Hmm.
Or I shouldn't pity that person. I should imagine me being that person, how I would want somebody to treat me in that situation. I think the best statement of this is the second statement of love in Leviticus 19. Love the foreigner as yourself, for you were once foreigners in the land of Egypt, and I am Yahweh. Right. So it clearly
Yes.
pulls out this: you were vulnerable, and it's how I treated you. And of course, this gets
Hmm.
reiterated in Paul later. Right. He loved us while we were yet sinners, kind of mentality.
Yes. That brings to mind Carmen Imes makes that point in terms of the slavery laws. All of the slavery laws in the Torah are predicated upon, for you were once slaves yourselves.
Right.
And so even the bin of those laws, we as 21st century modern Westerners look at this and the thought is, well, does the Torah condone slavery? As opposed to, no, there's a particular circumstance where the entire approach to the issue is characterized and colored by their oppression as slaves.
Right.
And so the approach is fundamentally different. Since you
Well,
brought it up,
can I
one of
talk on that slave issue for a second before you go on?
yeah, go
Because
for it.
I think it's such an important. I think slave is another. It's so triggering, especially to Americans, because we feel so
Yes.
guilty about our peculiar history of slavery.
Hmm.
So it's an important point for me to say, and a very famous theologian from an Ivy League university at our conference last week actually said something I don't think is correct, and that is that God was trying to get Israel out of slavery. And I don't think Exodus
Hmm.
supports that view. I don't think the Torah supports that view, because he calls them slaves after they're out, right? The
Hmm.
Israelites are always called slaves. Moses is called the slave of Yahweh. Joshua is called the slave of Moses. Israel is the slave to be slaves to God. In the New Testament, slaves to Christ. Jesus serves as a
Hmm.
slave to man. We are to serve as slaves to Christ. So slavery in its kind of raw conception, not the American version, not the exploitative, human trafficking, brutal, oppressive kind that Israel experienced, but the idea of having an employment compact with somebody and then that reaching beyond just the hours of labor that we commodify in modern American, I work this many hours, I get this much money, having it
Hmm.
extend more into their personal life. It's kind of like military service. It's probably a little bit more like that. And
Hmm.
so when you look at the slavery, and this makes a big difference when you look at the slavery laws, like in Exodus 21, you're like,
Hmm.
why do they have any slave laws at all? Well, because slavery was not the problem. The problem was the kind of slavery. And if you look at Exodus 1, it gives lots of adjectives about the cruel, the ruthless, the bitter oppression that they served under. It never talks about slavery itself as the problem. It talks about the cruel and the bitter and the oppressive version of slavery as the problem. So there's a way in
Hmm.
which we can think of slavery as kind of employment compact plus something else. We don't really have anything like this in modern American life, and we don't really need anything like this in modern American life. But then we can start imagining how slavery could then become oppressive, which is a lot of what those slavery laws are. Is like this cannot slip into oppression in the same way that you can't do it
Hmm.
as an employer today. You can't mistreat your employees, underpay them, refuse to pay them for things. So I think it's a
Yeah.
good example where um, we really want as Western Christians for it to say, and God ended slavery on that day, but we're missing the point
Hmm.
if we think slavery is ultimately the problem.
Yes. As I
You
read
probably
your
did not
book,
say that in the book.
well, no, as you talked about some of the slave issues, you came back to this and you kind of sprinkled it throughout. but it
Okay.
gets to the idea of the logic, right? It gets to the idea of the assumptions. And of course, again, going back to the Genesis narrative, you have not just the people as a whole in Exodus treated in an oppressive form of slavery, but you have someone like Joseph, who, how God uses slavery to bring about a good, but also to create an awareness that, again, the most blessed people, blessed by God, find themselves in that vulnerable situation. At which point, the logic of the law is that slavery is a human institution, especially that it existed at that time in a particular context, in a particular way. But I think it was in Exodus 21. I don't have it right in front of me, but even the idea of the protections that slaves are given, they dignify the slaves. You know, a
Right.
master, if you knock out the tooth, the slave goes free. If you injure a slave and lose the labor produced by that slave, then what you're doing is potentially inviting repercussions on yourself. If you take it too far, the family or the community is going to hold you accountable. But also, there's a relationship where you are hurting yourself as well as the slave, and that to me speaks again to this communal element. So maybe we could play something out here, Dr. Johnson. I tend to think of modern Westerners, or particularly, or we can just say Americans, we tend to think of law as a way to protect my rights. I
Mm,
have individual rights that need to be protected. Therefore, we're going to pass these legislative prohibitions to protect my rights individually. Whereas it seems like the biblical writers had a much more developed sense of the symbiotic relationship that we all had with one another.
yeah.
So if one person sins, it impacts the whole community. We don't have a police force that we delegate this enforcement to. We are participants in the enforcement
Right.
because what my neighbor does impacts me. So maybe we could turn the discussion to that aspect of the law, that this kind of what you do impacts me. We are brothers. The whole, again, foundation of the law is that we have brothers and neighbors, and there's varying degrees of responsibilities depending upon where you're at. But there's also mobility. The
Right.
stranger can become the brother. You know,
Right.
Ruth the Moabite can become the great grandmother of King David, that kind of aspect. Maybe we could talk about that aspect of the law.
Yeah, well, and I think, I used to teach at a college where they had heavy doses. Everybody had to take heavy doses of political thought, American political thought and practice. So I had
Hmm.
several political philosophy professors there that we would talk about this, like, is there any rights talk in scripture? And they would say, no, of course, they're not actually talking about rights in the way that we would mean them today legally.
Hmm.
But they would also be quick to point out that if you look at the founding fathers and the founding documents, they often talked about rights right next to responsibilities. Because you have this
Yes.
right, you also have this responsibility, right? And so
Hmm.
that's, yeah, it's only, of course, we've kind of thinned everything down to where I can do whatever I want. I have the right to do it. Nobody can tell me otherwise. And that's even like a persona that's valorized in some, like, you go girlism, as I call it, right? It's fair to say, I think we have a distorted view of rights. And if you want an example of that, go read the UN's Charter on Human Rights, and you'll be a little bit shocked about what they count as a human right, because it's things that we would certainly take for granted and think were obvious and available to
Hmm.
everybody today. The issue of, what do you do, like you said, when there is no police force? Like, what is justice when it's not handed over to the state? And I think I tried to point out in the book that there are all kinds of interesting examples where in deterrence theory and legal and criminology, that essentially, that if a criminal believes something's handed over to the state, they're less likely to be deterred because they know that
Hmm.
state's not going to punish them, or it's going to take a long time, or they can have appeals, or especially if it's like a capital crime, the chances
Hmm.
of getting executed for a capital crime. And so there's really not a lot of, almost no deterrence value for execution at the state level. It
Hmm.
just has no psychological effect. But if you think the brother of the person you killed is going to hunt you down and kill you, that has a very heavy deterrence factor. And so there's all kinds of complicating factors. What about a woman, the daughters of Zelophehad and Numbers, who have no
Hmm.
brothers and fathers left remaining, right? All men were killed in their clan. Who is going to protect them if they die, right? And seems to be some hints at some answers going on there in the book of Numbers. So you have some borderline cases, but the center mass of the thinking seems to be, we as a community have to do the policing. And
Hmm.
if you've ever been in the majority world where this is kind of the case, there is no government that really is in control, and the village has to kind of take justice into their own hands, that is usually not good. It usually is done
Mhm.
haphazardly. People can be accused of things very quickly, and somebody can be beaten or killed before you figure out, like, oh, they didn't actually do this thing that we thought they did, right? So
Mhm.
a lot of the law seems to be aiming at that level, that kind of mob mentality, the rashness of justice in a small village where everybody kind of has to live with each other. The other thing that I think is, I'm not celebrating anything. I think it's just the fact is you can't send anybody away to prison, right? So
Mhm.
our
Mhm.
view is like lock them up and send them away, and then we don't have to see them again, which is not true either in American culture, but that's the way we think about it. Here,
Mhm.
you have to live with the person who robbed you, like they still live down the street, right? Which this
Mhm.
happens in some communities, right? The people who harm the community come right back into the community. So a lot of that, what we call criminal law in the biblical law, is focused first on their responsibility to the community and how do they work that off. It's usually through an indentured slavery system. You
Mhm.
steal one sheep, you have to pay 4 sheep back. Well, if you stole one sheep, you probably don't have 4 sheep. And so now you have to go indenture yourself as a slave to the very person you stole from, where they
Mhm.
bring the victim and the perpetrator closer together over time. So
Mhm.
it's a different view. And I say all this saying that I'm not sure. You'd take some very good, creative legal minds to think about what this would look like today in a local community, like in,
Mhm.
in, in America. I don't know. So I say it because a lot of people are, I'll give a talk on this. And at the end of this, they're like, so how do we put these biblical law principles into use in our legal system? And I'm like, I think you'd have to do it very, very carefully because you have to translate all the laws. There's not a single law in the Torah that doesn't need some kind of translation into another circumstance. And that's true within the Old Testament. Those laws have to
Yeah.
get translated over 1,000 years in the Old Testament as well.
Well, and that's an aspect as I consider your emphasis on Iron Age Israel, the laws are intended for an agrarian context. And yet also it's true that over time, as these laws face the test of civilizational development, you have the laws in the wilderness, you have the laws in the promised land, you have the
Yeah.
laws under the monarchy, you have the laws in Paul and Jesus' day. Clearly the context changes. And yet, I think that's part of what Paul and Jesus are doing is they're recontextualizing
Yeah.
both in terms of new covenant and what God is doing in redemptive history, but also in terms of, in some ways, they had moved past some of the subsistence, at least the agrarian context of the immediate entry into the promised land. And so, in terms of translating it, I think we see that being done by the biblical authors in real time over time. But I want to talk about this to make sure we get to it. One of the things that you do in this book is you give especially a new reader, someone who is coming to the law, trying to understand it. You give some handles, you give some categories that I think are very helpful. So before you dive into the deepest into the pool, you help us just get our feet wet. And one of those categories that I think is especially helpful is the distinction between principles that are broad and in a sense universal, and then specific cases where those principles are worked out. So
Yeah.
for instance, Deuteronomy 15, be generous, be open handed toward the poor, be open handed toward the vulnerable, general principle. And then a specific application is, oh, and in your heart, don't think the seventh year, which would be a year of forgiveness of debts, don't think that that's coming. And therefore, in your own heart, say, well, I'm not being generous, essentially because I'm not going to make as much money or get as
Right.
much out of it, or there's nothing in for me. So maybe you can talk about that principle of you have principles, you have specific cases, and how that helps us in understanding law, especially for the person who's maybe has read it before, but wants to dive deeper. Can you talk about that for us?
Yeah, I appreciate that particular point because for me, this was a great awakening in my thinking on the biblical law that probably happened about 10 years ago.
Mm-hmm.
And I realize if it's a principle, what's the point of the instances? Well, the instances are to sharpen what the principle means. So the principle is actually
Mm-hmm.
insufficient on its own. And it's like if I say to my kids, hey, be good to each other, right? Well, what does that mean, right? If they're arguing, just be good to each other.
Mm-hmm.
I need to say, no, you shouldn't slap them in the face, or no, you can't talk to your sister that way, or something like that.
Mm-hmm.
So it's the same thing here. By the way, the 10 things, or we call them the 10 commandments, but as you know, they're just called the 10 devarim, the 10 words or things.
Mm-hmm.
They're all principles. None of them are commandments. None of them are
Mm-hmm.
instances. Do not murder, I think I outlined in the book is once you consider the context in which do not murder ends up on that tablet, it becomes very confusing as to what murder means.
Mm-hmm.
But the the instances help sharpen the direction of the principle and kind of how you should take it. How, so you can't
Hmm.
read them apart from one another. So you mentioned the striking your slave in the eye and the tooth. Those two lines, you cannot strike your slave, or if you strike your slave in the eye, or if you strike your slave in the tooth. Those are two sentences, one right after the other, and immediately before them is eye for eye, tooth for tooth, wound for wound, burn for burn, foot for
Yes.
foot. Again, eye for an eye, tooth for tooth. Clearly, a principle, a very confusing principle, because the rabbis, try to work out exactly the they treat it like it's a law, a rule, and they can't
Hmm.
figure out how it will work. Because as one rabbi says, a blind man would be free to do whatever he wanted in this land, right? So
Hmm.
but all you have to do is just say, okay, eye for an eye, tooth for tooth. That feels like a principle, because we don't think they actually just meant eye and tooth, but it extends to the rest of the body.
Hmm.
So it's building a paradigm. And then, well, wait, what are we supposed to be doing with this? It's about my slave or somebody, a servant, right?
Hmm.
So what's interesting to me is you might walk, if you just think of eye for eye, tooth for tooth in general, you might think it's just this brutal, you hit me, you're going to get yours kind of a thing. But
Hmm.
then, as I pointed out in the book, there is no instance of eye for an eye, tooth for tooth in the Bible where the actual recompense is an eye or a tooth or the same thing that got struck. It's always moves into a different realm. The different
Hmm.
realm here, which is surprising, I think, to most people, including myself, when I kind of first realized this, is the principle is sharpened by two instances that basically say are the one you need to worry about here. You're the one who's going to have power over somebody, and you better not use that power to exploit somebody. And if you do, the very reason that you paid all this money for their services is going to evaporate before your eyes, right? So you lose
Yeah.
if you touch them. Which again, that alone, eye for an eye, tooth for tooth, and which functionally means you cannot beat people with whom you have power over, which you wonder if this extends then, okay, is this to your wife, your sister, your children, your mother,
Hmm.
other people who you might be stronger than or have some kind of natural authority over in that culture. If you want to talk about a controversial statement in the Iron Age, ancient Near East, the idea that you cannot hit your slave would have been a radical idea, right? Like you
Yeah.
can't touch your slave. What? Well, how do you discipline them when they don't do what you tell them to do, right? So okay, so
Hmm.
that's one of my practical examples.
The Torah gives us these principles in order to shape our imagination about cases that are forthcoming but have not been tried yet. In
Yes,
other words, you have the principle, you have the specific case, but implied in that is that there will be more cases where your moral imagination, your imagination, I think, as you put it, for justice and righteousness, it's being shaped as you think about these things. And so, even Deuteronomy 6, right? The Shema, well, teach these things to your children when you rise up or when you lay down or when you go out. It's not about helping them memorize a list of legal codes. It's about their moral imagination being shaped by the principles, being honed by the instances.
right,
But I think a little bit of N.T. Wright, he talked about this with the New Testament, but a four-act play where the fifth act is lost, but the first, we're learning to be actors within that world. We're
right.
learning to have our imagination shaped by that. Another aspect of that, and I know we're running out of time, so I want to move through this quickly, but another aspect that you give here is in the law, oftentimes there are clusters of laws or there are sections of laws that are sort of embedded within other narratives, and they become, in a sense, mutually interpretive. They are listed in such a way that here's 10 instances, but there's five other instances you could think of quickly that are not included. And yet again, your imagination is being formed so that when you approach that, you'll approach it with the right instincts. So you can comment on that if you want to. I just want to point it out to the listeners. And then one other thing, as you think about the lex talionis, eye for eye, tooth for tooth, again, I do come back in my own mind to the narrative, especially Genesis 1 through 11, where going back to the language of rights and responsibilities, God says to Cain, again, brother, 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 tailed in the brotherhood relationship are responsibilities that
Right.
as sin multiplies, then unfortunately, these things do have to be spelled out. You know, to my kids, be kind to one another. Well, then all of a sudden someone slaps, and I have to say, that's not what kindness means. And laws multiply in order to clarify. But I love, again, how you come back over and over again to this is formational for individuals. How do you think? It's formational for communities. How do we think? in ways that can lead to flourishing. And this is where I think a good place to maybe try to land the plane. It's all reflecting the character of God as God's people.
Right.
You mentioned that in the book, that in one sense, I believe the way you say it is the relationship with God has with Israel is a different species and maybe a different genus completely, or I may have switched those around, but it just completely different than other ancient Near Eastern law codes, even if there's similar content. Even if
Right.
you look at Hammurabi and say, hey, maybe we can compare these, there's a different ultimate foundation, which is God is creating a people to be his vessel to the nations, and therefore the formation of their moral imagination is missional. It's
Mm.
for a purpose. So maybe you can help us think about the law in those terms, God creating a people that reflect his character and how that plays into the law.
Well, thank you for letting me talk about that because I love this topic. And two books I'll recommend here are written by Jewish thinkers, friends of mine. Jerry Unterman's Justice for All, How the Jewish Bible, Hebrew Bible, Revolutionized Ethics. So if you want to hear that, he's an expert who he did his PhD with Jacob Milgram, who is a very famous Leviticus scholar. And he talks about basically how is the Hebrew Bible different than the ancient Near Eastern, all these other texts and ideas. And it's a very conservatively, and I mean conservative, like he doesn't make hoopla. He just says, here's the real ways in which our Old Testament is different than the other ancient Near Eastern. And then Leon Kass's Founding a Nation, which is basically a commentary on Exodus by a Jewish
Mm.
scholar, but he's not a biblical scholar. But he says, with a lot of other Jewish commentary as well, that God starts, which I think you said this as well, he starts with a group of slaves. There is no,
Mm.
he starts with a group of people who have no nobility amongst them. There are no internal power structures. The only kind of structuring you see is a Moses, which he's just called, and we're not even clear why Moses is called. Like, what is it about him? But the only other structures are wise elders, like or the Spirit of
Mm.
God, right? So it's kind of a blank slate technology for starting a nation. And then I think this is my opinion. This is okay. I'm out there on a limb, but I view the Eden narrative as kind of like the goal was to plant an Eden because all we get is what's going on in Eden. We don't know what's going on in the rest of the world.
Mhm.
As far as we can tell, the rest of the world is dirt at this point. So we only get Eden. And the goal is to like identify the rest of the world, to expand
Mhm.
Eden out, right? As they had children and multiplied, it would just bring Eden out to the world. You get the same pattern, it looks like, in Canaan when he brings Israel in to Canaan, where he's coaching them at this point. Like, look, your job is to bring justice and righteousness out into the world. That this is how you're going to be a blessing to all the families of the earth from Genesis 12. And so the goal is, the promised land is the entire ancient Near East, including Egypt, right?
Mhm.
But he plants them in this one little crappy section of the promised land, Israel. If you don't know how bad it is there, it's the only part of the Fertile Crescent that's not so fertile. He plants them in that land in order for them to Israelify, as one of my friends used to say, is the goal was the Israelification of the world, which essentially
Mm.
means bringing this justice and righteousness out to people who desperately needed it. And you see that when Israel encounters Rahab, right? Someone who like
Yes.
thirsts for the justice that Israel is going to bring to her own people on both
Mhm.
sides, both kind of judgment in that sense, but also like that there's like that she will have a place in that society. And as the author of Joshua notes, and her people are with us to this day, right? In
Mhm.
Joshua 4.
Mhm.
So I think that idea, and then again, I can't miss the opportunity to point out, Jesus also says, stay here in Jerusalem, right, until power comes from on high, and I send you out to the ends of the earth. So that kind of
Mhm.
planting and expanding view seems to be what's in mind, which I think then can help us understand some of the harshness, both in the New Testament, Ananias and Sapphira getting struck dead for doing,
Mhm.
a minor lie while they were doing something good. And the same thing with the striking dead of the priest, Nadab and Abihu, the blasphemer. And is if your goal is you're using these people to spread justice and righteousness, and they're not doing the very basics after they witnessed all these signs and wonders that were meant for them to trust God wholly so that they could bring his trustworthy justice out into the world to protect and bring in and beautify the world in some way, then you are toxic to the mission. I think
Mhm.
the example I give in the book is you're like an astronaut on a space station who's gone rogue, who's pulling apart the space station, bolt by bolt. At some
Mhm.
point, if you can't stop them, you're just going to have to send them out the airlock, right?
Mhm.
So there's a little bit of that mentality going on here. And in the mission mindset. And so that I take that Genesis 12, like a lot of biblical theologians do, that being a blessing to all the families of the earth is as serious a theological statement in scripture as you will ever find. I think it's also the reason why God tries to kill Moses.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Pharaoh sought to kill him. And you're like, wait, he sought to kill Moses because his son wasn't circumcised? What's the big deal? Well, if your son isn't circumcised, it might indicate that you're not on board with the mission to go to all the families of the earth.
Mm-hmm.
That's my best guess in the passage, which is a very strange passage, I'll admit.
Yeah. Well, that immediately reminds me that the Israelites, they were learning about God's character both through the Exodus and through the law in the same way that the rest of the world was.
Yeah.
And we tend to forget that their ideas of God were still very much being formed. And
Mm.
so they saw God's power, they saw his deliverance in the Exodus, but the law was meant to, as again you state so eloquently, to shape their moral imagination. And I love the way both the critique of the rest of the Old Testament and then subsequently the New is based upon the fact that biblical Israel, Old Testament Israel, they failed at that vocation. They became worse than the nations that they were meant to
Right.
Israelify. The osmosis worked in reverse. But at the same time, what I love is you have examples, and you mentioned Rahab. I love to play this through my mind, Dr. Johnson, that if we take the genealogy in Ruth seriously, Boaz, and Matthew tells us this, that Rahab was Boaz's mother.
Right.
And if we take that seriously, it helps to understand his moral imagination was shaped by his experience in such a way that when he saw Ruth, he was able to think biblically about the law. He was a virtuous and righteous man, but he
Right.
was able to see it in a way that enabled him to see Ruth differently, the purposes of God differently. And so you have examples of this even in the Old Testament itself of what it looks like for this to be done well, what it looks like for it to be done poorly, and
Mhm.
then ultimately in the New Testament, what it looks like to be done in one sense completely differently through the lens of what Jesus came to do. And so again,
I
I'll give
wish
you
I
the
had said
last
that in
word
the
here.
book.
Yeah, well, but
It was
you
very
set the
eloquently
stage.
put.
Well, you set the stage, and that's what, again, for our listeners, I genuinely hope you take the time to pick up this book and read it. And I'll say this before giving you the last word, Dr. Johnson. I appreciate that you brought up devotional reading of the Bible is crucial. It's important. And yet, if we approach the Torah in that way only, we are inevitably going to misunderstand its intentions.
Mhm.
It is meant to be in its totality formational.
Right.
And there's a reason that we refer to it as Torah, again, from Genesis all the way to
Right.
Deuteronomy. And so that's my encouragement to you readers. So many good handles. We don't even have time. You included a narrative throughout here to give a practical example. I thought that was incredibly helpful. So
That
what an
was the part I
incredible
was
tool.
most nervous about. 'Cause I've never written fiction before, and so it was a kind of a first attempt.
Well, I'll tell you the truth, Dr. Johnson. As I read it at first, I'm like, man, this could go one of two ways. It could be good or it could be bad. And in the end, it
Yep.
was good. It
Okay.
really, I think, I'll just tease the listeners with it. If you want a narrative embedded within a nonfiction book to help you understand, Dr. Johnson did that. I did think it was helpful to situate it in real life. Not just what it looks like sitting on our desk in 21st century opulent West, but what would it have looked like? So I commend it. Readers, check out this book. It's going to be helpful to you. And Dr. Johnson, any last words before I wrap this up for us?
No, I thank you for giving me the time to talk about it, because I think it's very important. And I think what you said, this issue of formation, even as you're saying it, it struck up some ideas in my mind. If, as Christians, we are not reading Scripture in general, Jesus is teaching for sure in the same vein, but also the Torah, if we're not reading it, saying, and then looking around in our world and saying, okay, how many cars we own? What would the Torah say about that? What kind of question could we ask to get there to think about? What would be the right question to put to the Torah and to see what it would think about our lives today, or what we're doing in our churches, or thinking about, we love to talk about what's going on politically, or some people do, right? And like, okay, well, what's the Torah's, but like, where would the Torah fall on this, on the issue of vulnerability? And I think you actually would end up in some surprising places that are not so obvious, but it's, like you said, it's expecting us to do that work. It gave us the paradigms so that we can extend them into our world. And we do that very poorly, as far as I can tell, because we're not taking the text seriously as formative and educational. And I mean that like it's hard even at a Christian college to get all your different disciplines to see scripture as like an intellectually formative, set of text.
Yeah. Yeah. Well said. I appreciate again your interdisciplinary approach to these issues. Dr. Johnson, that was very helpful as well. So for our listeners, again, the book is Understanding Biblical Law, Skills for Thinking with and Through Torah. Dr. Johnson, thank you so much for being generous with your time, and check out this book. We hope if you enjoyed this podcast, leave us a rating, a review, share the content with others. We'd love to get the word out about In With the Old. I'll extend my thanks one last time to Dr. Johnson. Thank you so much for being with us today. And to our listeners, until next time, stay cool and stay old.